It was a quiet evening, the kind where the hum of the fridge in the kitchen is the loudest sound in the house. The sun had set, and soft light bathed the room as I sat there, waiting for her. But what happened next? Well, let's just say I never imagined I'd find myself in this situation. It started a few weeks ago. Things had felt different. You know how you can sense it when something shifts, even if you can't quite put your finger on it? The little things stand out. Fewer words exchanged at dinner, a distracted look during conversations, or those sudden bursts of irritation that seemed to come from nowhere. I chalked it up to stress at first. Life has a way of pulling us in different directions, doesn't it? But then there was the phone. Her phone, to be exact. Always close by, screen turned down. It wasn't like her. She'd always been so open, so casual about leaving it on the counter or the sofa. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. After all, trust is built on giving people the benefit of the doubt, right? Still, a seed of unease had been planted, and it grew, watered by every quiet glance and half-hearted smile. That evening, I decided to stay home. She thought I'd left for work. She'd even kissed me goodbye at the door. But something in me couldn't leave. Call it intuition or simply a need for answers, but I stayed. The hours passed slowly. I kept busy, though my mind was anything but calm. Every sound from the street made my heart race. Was she expecting someone? Or was this all in my head? The clock struck 7, and that's when I heard it, the sound of her car in the driveway. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed still, sitting at the kitchen table, my fingers drumming nervously against the wood. She walked in, her keys jingling in her hand, humming a tune under her breath. But when she turned the corner and saw me sitting there, her face froze. "You didn't leave?" she said, her voice catching slightly, though she tried to mask it with a casual smile. I looked at her, trying to gauge her expression. Was it surprise? Panic? Relief? It was hard to tell. "No," I replied evenly. "I thought I'd stay home tonight." She set her bag down carefully, her movements slower than usual. "Oh," she said. "That's nice. I wasn't expecting you." And there it was. That tiny crack in her voice that spoke volumes. Her reaction lingered in the air like the faint smell of something burning, not quite alarming, but enough to catch your attention. I watched her carefully, trying to keep my expression neutral. Inside, though, my thoughts were racing. Why had she frozen like that? What was she hiding? She moved to the sink, busying herself with a glass of water. Her back was to me, and I could see her shoulders tense as she took a slow sip. "So," she began, her voice light, too light. "How was your day? Did you finish that report you were working on?" It felt like a script, a forced line meant to steer the conversation away from something deeper. "Yeah," I replied simply, not giving her much to work with. Silence hung between us, thick and heavy. She placed the glass down, but her hands lingered on the counter, gripping it like she needed something solid to hold onto. And then, she turned around, a smile plastered on her face. "I was actually about to start dinner," she said. "Thought I'd surprise you when you got home." "Surprise me?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "You didn't think I'd be here, though, right?" Her smile faltered for a split second, barely noticeable, but I caught it. "Well, I thought you might have come back later. You know, after your usual time." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. Plans change. Sometimes it's nice to be spontaneous. There was a shift in her demeanor, subtle but telling. She laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're acting weird," she said, her tone attempting to sound playful. "What's with all the questions?" "I could ask you the same thing," I replied evenly, my gaze steady. "Why do you seem so surprised to see me?" Her eyes darted to the side, a fleeting glance that spoke louder than any words. "I'm not surprised," she said, forcing another laugh. "I just didn't hear you come back in, that's all." It was a weak excuse, and we both knew it. At that moment, I realized something important. Confrontation wasn't the answer. Not yet, anyway. Whatever was going on, she wasn't ready to say it. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't ready to hear it. The truth has a way of revealing itself when the time is right. All I had to do was be patient and pay attention. What would you have done in my shoes? Confront her outright or play it cool? In part 3, we'll dive deeper into the signs and signals that can reveal more than words ever could. Because sometimes the story isn't in what people say, it's in what they don't. She turned back to the counter, her movements mechanical, as though she were trying to busy herself enough to avoid further questions. The silence between us wasn't just awkward, it was telling. But I decided to lean into it, letting her actions do the talking. Sometimes, people reveal more when you give them the space to fill the silence themselves. I watched as she opened the fridge, pulling out ingredients for what looked like a half-hearted attempted dinner. A few vegetables, some eggs. She placed them on the counter and hesitated, as if she'd forgotten what she was doing. "Do you want an omelet or something?" she asked, her voice overly casual. "Sure," I said, my tone calm but deliberate. "Whatever you feel like making." She nodded, but her hands fumbled as she cracked the eggs into a bowl. A small shell fell in, and she spent an awkward few seconds fishing it out. It wasn't like her. She was always so sure-handed in the kitchen. Watching her now, it was clear her mind was elsewhere. As she whisked the eggs, I decided to ask something simple, but pointed. "So, how was your day?" Her hand paused for just a moment before she answered. "Busy," she said quickly, too quickly. "Work was, the usual. Meetings, emails. Nothing exciting. Nothing exciting." The words hung in the air, almost daring me to challenge them. Instead, I leaned forward slightly and asked, "And after work?" She glanced over her shoulder, her smile strained. "What do you mean? Did you go anywhere? Run errands, maybe?" She turned back to the bowl, avoiding my gaze.
"Just home," she said.
"Straight home." It wasn't her words that caught my attention, it was the way she said them. The tightness in her voice, the way her hands moved just a little too quickly as she stirred the eggs. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How people give themselves away without even realizing it. A flicker of hesitation, a slight change in their tone, it's all there if you're paying attention. But I didn't press. Not yet. Instead, I let the conversation drift into safer territory, asking her about a show we'd been watching and whether she'd heard from her sister lately. She answered, but the tension never fully left her. As she poured the eggs into the pan, I caught myself thinking about trust. It's such a fragile thing, isn't it? Built slowly, over time, but capable of shattering in an instant. I didn't want to accuse her of anything, at least, not without knowing for sure. But the signs were there, subtle as they were, and they were impossible to ignore. Sometimes the hardest part isn't finding the truth, it's deciding what to do with it once you do. In part 4, I'll share the next steps I took and the moment I uncovered something that changed everything. The smell of cooking eggs filled the kitchen, but it did little to settle the uneasy tension that hung between us. I kept my composure, watching her closely as she moved around, trying to act normal. But the thing about trying too hard to appear normal is that it often has the opposite effect. Her every movement seemed deliberate, as if she were trying to suppress the weight of her own thoughts. As she slid the omelet onto a plate and placed it in front of me, I noticed something else. She wasn't eating. "Aren't you hungry?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Oh, I had a late lunch," she replied quickly, waving it off with a small smile. "I'll probably just have tea later." It was another small thing, but it added to the growing list. She always ate with me. Dinner was one of those small rituals we never skipped, no matter how busy we were. Yet here she was, breaking that routine without a second thought. I nodded, pretending not to notice. I took a bite of the omelet. It was good, but my appetite had all but disappeared. As I ate, she leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone. For the first time that evening, she seemed relaxed, even distracted. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a notification that lit up her screen. It was just a flash, gone before I could fully read it, but the name was unfamiliar. A man's name. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Who's that?" I asked, nodding toward her phone. She froze for half a second, her thumb hovering over the screen. "Oh, just someone from work," she said, dismissively. "Nothing important." "Someone new?" I asked casually, pretending to be more interested in my plate than her reaction. Yeah, she said, her voice a little too light. He's been helping with a project. Nothing major. I let the conversation drop, but inside, I was reeling. It could have been innocent. I wanted to believe it was. But the way she brushed it off felt too practiced, too intentional. It wasn't the first time I'd heard that name either. A week ago, she'd mentioned him in passing, saying he'd joined her team recently. It hadn't meant much to me then, but now it felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. After dinner, she excused herself, saying she needed to finish some work. I nodded, watching her leave the room. Once I was alone, I sat there in silence, staring at my plate. My thoughts were racing, a jumble of questions and possibilities. Finally, I decided I needed to know more. Not by confronting her, that would only push her further away if something was going on. No, I needed to observe, to pay attention to the details she might not realize she was giving away. That night, I waited until she went to bed before I made my move. Her phone was on the coffee table, the screen dark. I didn't want to snoop. I hated the idea of invading her privacy. But sometimes, the answers we need are right in front of us, waiting to be seen. In part 5, I'll share what I found, and the moment everything changed. It's often the smallest details that carry the biggest truths. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every creak of the floorboard sound louder than it should. I sat there for a long time, staring at her phone on the coffee table. It felt wrong, like I was crossing a line. But the unanswered questions in my mind were louder than my doubts. Sometimes, the search for the truth feels like a necessity, even if it comes at a cost. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the phone. Then I reminded myself, this wasn't about distrust for the sake of it. It was about understanding what had changed between us. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked it. She'd always trusted me with her passcode, which made this feel even more complicated. Her notifications were clear, no new messages, no missed calls. But when I opened her messages app, I saw it. A string of conversations, all harmless at first glance. But then there was one name that stood out, Daniel, the same name I glimpsed on her screen earlier. I tapped on it, my heart pounding. The messages started innocently enough, mostly about work. Deadlines, schedules, project updates. But as I scrolled further, the tone began to shift. The words became more personal. They joked, shared anecdotes, and then came the emojis. Smiley faces, laughing faces, small things, but they felt like cracks in the wall. And then a message caught my eye. I really appreciate you being there for me. It's been hard to talk to anyone else about this. I stopped reading. My mind raced as I tried to process what I'd just seen.
What was she talking about?
What had been so hard to share that she hadn't told me? My first instinct was anger, but it was quickly replaced by something else, doubt. Had I missed something? Had I not been there for her in the way she needed me to be? I set the phone down, my hands trembling slightly. This wasn't proof of anything, I told myself. It wasn't an admission of wrongdoing. But it was enough to confirm that there was a distance between us, one that I hadn't fully understood until now. When she came back into the living room a little later, I acted as though nothing had happened. She smiled at me, sitting down on the couch with a book in her hand. I smiled back, but inside, I felt like I was looking at her through a different lens. That night, I lay awake, replaying the messages in my head. What did they mean? Was this just a friendship, or was it something more? And more importantly, why did I feel like a stranger in my own relationship? The next morning, the air between us felt heavy, though neither of us said a word about it. She moved around the house as if nothing was wrong, humming softly while making coffee. I watched her, wondering how we'd gotten here, how we'd become two people living side by side but miles apart in our hearts. I'd spent the night wrestling with my thoughts. Confrontation felt inevitable, but I didn't want to come at it with anger or assumptions. If there was any chance of salvaging what we had, it would start with honesty. So, as she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, I took a deep breath and decided to lay it all out. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. She looked up at me, her expression guarded. About what? She asked, though I could tell she already knew. I sat across from her, meeting her eyes. About us. About what's been going on lately. I feel like something's changed, and I need to know what it is. She set her mug down, her fingers tightening around the handle. I don't know what you mean, she said quietly, but her voice betrayed her. You do, I replied gently. Things have been different, and I think we both feel it. I found the messages, Sarah. Between you and Daniel. Her face froze, just like it had the night before when she saw me in the kitchen. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and I could see the internal struggle written all over her face. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping. It's not what you think, she said, her voice trembling. Daniel, he's just a friend. Someone I've been talking to about things I didn't know how to bring up with you. Things like what? I asked, my voice softening. She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. I've been feeling overwhelmed, she admitted. With work, with life, with us. I didn't know how to talk to you because I didn't want to seem weak or like I was blaming you. Daniel was just there to listen. That's all. Her words hit me like a wave. She wasn't lying. I could see the truth in her eyes. But that didn't make it any less painful. Why didn't you feel like you could talk to me? I asked, my voice tinged with hurt. Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head. I don't know. I guess I felt like I had to have it all together for you. You're always so strong, so sure of yourself. I didn't want to burden you with my doubts. Sarah, I said, leaning forward. You're never a burden to me. You're my partner. If something's weighing on you, I want to know about it. I need to know about it. That's how we get through things, together. The tears spilled over then, and she wiped them away quickly, laughing nervously.
I feel so stupid, she said.
I should have just talked to you. No, I said gently. You're not stupid. But we can't keep doing this, keeping things bottled up, hiding from each other. If we're going to move forward, we need to be honest. Always. She nodded, her expression softening. You're right.
I'm sorry.
For everything. And I'm sorry if I've made you feel like you couldn't come to me, I said. That's on me, too. In that moment, something shifted. The wall that had been between us began to crumble, piece by piece. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was a start. We sat there for a long time, talking about everything we'd been holding back. The fears, the doubts, the things we'd both been too afraid to say. Sometimes, the hardest part of love isn't facing the problems, it's admitting they exist. But once you do, there's a chance to rebuild. And in the end, that's what we chose to do.
Together.